Hi! Today I want to hit you guys with a review for Uprooted by Naomi Novik, a 2015 standalone fantasy novel that I've seen recommended many times as one of the best modern standalone fantasy novels. You know, sometimes you don't want to read a 10-book series of bricks just for some fantasy. Sometimes you want something that stands on its own, and people talk about this book a lot in that context. Uprooted is set up like and plays out like and reads like a classic fairy tale. It's very reminiscent, to me at least, of a classic Disney princess type story, but this one's set in a Russian backdrop, a Russian folklore-esque backdrop, which is something that I'm not terribly familiar with, so forgive me if I make or have any misconceptions because of my ignorance. Also, apparently this book is being adapted by Ellen DeGeneres, so apparently that's a thing. So, the story of Uprooted revolves around a young girl named Neshka, who lives in a small village that is ruled by a wizard who lives in an isolated tower. And this wizard's name, very ominously, is the Dragon. Normally the wizard lives alone, with the exception of one young girl from the village, who he picks out every 10 years, and he picks a new one every 10 years, and the old one can leave after 10 years, and that's the only other person who ever lives in this tower with him. So what happens in this story is, unsurprisingly, our protagonist, Neshka, is selected to live in the tower with the wizard. Unfortunately, I wasn't really a fan of this book, so I guess this is going to be my first negative video, or mostly negative. It's not entirely negative, but I didn't really come out of this book having enjoyed it. For a lot of it, I was kind of waiting for it to be over because I didn't really care for the fundamental core of the story, which is the relationship between the wizard, aka the dragon, and our protagonist Neshka. See, the thing is, the dragon is kind of an asshole. He's constantly verbally abusive to Neshka, regardless of what she does or how she does it, and it's extremely frustrating to read, but of course, it's kind of by intention. It's not like he was designed to be a likable character all the time and he was frustrating because he wasn't. He was clearly designed to be unlikable. But the thing is, it didn't really work for me, even though it was by design, because Neshka puts up with his constantly abusive behavior. Now, normally you could say, well, it's a feudal society. She's a young girl who's living alone with a lord. Of course she's gonna put up with him. She doesn't have a choice. That's how the power dynamic is, and it's totally valid to say that. But in my opinion, it isn't really valid in the context of this story because Neshka isn't characterized as someone who gives a shit about stuff like that. Neshka is characterized as someone who has no regard for propriety or hierarchy or her place in society. She doesn't fit into a traditional pseudo-feudal feminine gender role whatsoever. She's clumsy, outdoorsy, and like I said, does not display significant respect for authority. She's not that type of person. She's not portrayed as timid, and yet she puts up with him regardless. Especially in the beginning of the book, and this is so frustrating to read. You have to understand that a lot of the narrative of this book revolves around these two characters and their relationship and just them living in this tower. So if that relationship doesn't land, then the book does not work. And for me, the relationship did not land, so for me, the book didn't really work. Now, as you might expect, since these two are in a tower together all the time, as time goes on, they get a little bit warmer towards each other, they get a little closer, especially the dragon, who is an asshole at the start, like irrevocably an asshole at the start. He is less of an asshole as time goes on. But even though the book kept trying to convince me that they were growing closer together, I never actually felt invested in that relationship. I never felt that there was a significant amount of chemistry between these two that made me want to turn the page of this story. And I have to mention one specific thing about their relationship, which is a mild spoiler, so I guess I'll put a timestamp or something if you really don't want to know anything, but I don't think it's a significant spoiler, so I'll just go ahead and say it. There's a romance aspect to this relationship between the dragon and Neshka, and boy do I hate it. I should point out that the dragon is over 100 years old. He doesn't look like an old man. He doesn't look like Gandalf or anything. He looks more or less like a dude in his mid-30s to mid-40s. He doesn't age very fast because of the fact that he is a powerful wizard. But he is over 100 years old, and Neshka is a teenager. Ew. Like really, really ew. Like super duper ew. Now, I understand that a lot of fantasy portrays underage characters in romantic relationships with older characters, like significantly older, like so much older that we would put them in jail if that happened in real life. But Uprooted is a fairy tale. Like, yeah, sure, there is some darker content in this than there would be in an actual Disney story, but the overall tone of this book is not a gritty or dark tone. It is impossible to read this romance as anything other than romanticized, and I find that so gross. I can't. I genuinely hated every inkling of romance we got in this book. But that's enough about that. I don't want to rant too much about one specific thing. Unfortunately, there is more to criticize about this book. On top of me not really buying the relationship between these two, be it romantic or otherwise, and on top of me not really liking the dragon as a character, even though he is kind of meant to be unlikable. That's fair, that's totally fair. I also didn't really love Neshka as a protagonist. I get her, I get the type of character that she is supposed to be, but I still never really got super invested. Neshka is kind of a Mary Sue, and I say kind of because I'm very wary of just throwing that accusation out. It gets overused a lot. She's only kind of a Mary Sue because she does have very explicitly defined weaknesses. She's not just amazing at everything and loved by everyone because she's the main character. She's bad at some stuff. She's kind of clumsy and doesn't really care much for propriety, which naturally puts her at a bit of a disadvantage when she's in political situations. But in the context of the narrative and in terms of things that actually matter, she never really fails at anything. She's never bad at anything that actually has a meaningful consequence. Like, yeah, okay, she's explicitly bad at certain types of magic on top of being bad at propriety, but that doesn't really end up going anywhere because her own brand of magic leads to her constantly pulling things out of her ass that get her out of every situation she's in. It means nothing to be bad at something if your being bad at that thing is completely counteracted by the things that you are good at. Let me give you an example that kind of illustrates my problem without spoiling this book specifically. So imagine you read a story where someone is said to be too weak to swing a sword, right? They're too weak to swing a sword, so they can't really fight, except they're amazing at magic and can conjure a sword that is indestructible and weightless, and because of that, they're able to fight for pretty much any length of time, and also they're super agile and super good at every other aspect of fighting that doesn't require actually physically swinging a sword. So now, because of the fact that they can just generate a sword that is better than a real one in every conceivable way anyways, their weakness actually has no meaning. That's kind of how I feel about Neshka. Like, yeah, she's bad at some kinds of magic, but in any meaningful way, she is amazing at like magic and anything that the story requires, really. And so coming out of this book, I was pretty disappointed in Neshka as a character. There's this whole pseudo Mary Sue-esque treatment in the story, but on top of that, for a coming-of-age style setup, you know, there's a young protagonist who has a drastic change in their circumstances. In this case, she has to go live in this tower with this old wizard dude. For a character like that, by the end you expect there to be some significant change, some significant lesson learned, some way in which they have matured compared to where they started. But that maturation doesn't just come out of nowhere. It has to come from weakness. It has to come from failure. It has to come from overcoming something internal, not just something external. This book had her overcoming external things for sure, but nothing in here that was really compelling and made me feel like she grew up truly in any meaningful way. Now, there are other characters in this book, and I actually found some of them to be more interesting and more readable than the actual two main characters, But again, because of the fact that the two main characters are so much more important and take up so much more page time and their relationship is so core to the story, it doesn't really make up for the fact that I didn't care about them. In fact, the part of the book that I found most enjoyable by far was the section of the book where the two main characters are separate. Because this section of the book puts Neshka, the protagonist, in new, uncomfortable situations that somewhat counteract the problems that I have with her as a character, although not completely, and it also removes the asshole-ish and creepy influence of the dragon. This is by far the best section of the book. Unfortunately, this section doesn't really last long in the grand scheme of things, so, and what can you do? I did say though this review would not be entirely negative, so I do want to talk about some positives. Before I close out, I mentioned that Neshka does overcome external things, multiple times throughout the story, which leads me to the antagonist, the thing that needs to be overcome. The antagonist in this book is by far the most interesting thing about it. It is a forest. Literally. The antagonist is an evil forest. This forest is called the Wood. It hates humans and it's constantly trying to expand its territory, to overtake human territory and corrupt humans, who then become essentially walking zombies that it can control. I found this pretty refreshing. It puts our protagonists in opposition to a force of nature, not just symbolically, but literally a force of nature. Like trees are evil in this book, and they have to find a way to defeat a forest. How do you do that? It's interesting, especially when you compare it to the landscape of fantasy villains who often take the form of some kind of evil dark lord or some kind of dark wizard or both. Sometimes it's both. Often they are antagonists who need to be physically overcome through some kind of combat. But it's a little bit different here. The way you fight the forest is by fighting its influence, which is a little bit different from physically defeating a physical being who is physically trying to kill your ass physically. Did I say physical enough times? You get the idea. Like if you walk into the forest, you don't just gotta worry about getting jumped by all the corrupted people who are basically zombies. You also gotta worry about pollen and shit. You gotta wear like a mask and make sure you don't breathe no fumes or drink any dirty water. Like you're watching out for COVID in this story, essentially. Which is a little different from most fantasy antagonists, but it doesn't really do enough to make up for all the problems that I had with this book. Like, yeah, the antagonist is cool, but they're not that cool. So that about wraps it up. I wasn't really a fan. This book didn't really get its roots in me, if you know what I'm saying. But people really do like this book a lot. It gets recommended all the time, so if you're watching this, your mileage may vary. But it is very heavily dependent on how tolerant you are to icky romances. So with all that said, I hope you're having a good time. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're taking care of yourself. And if you enjoyed this video, please give me some feedback. If you didn't enjoy this video, please give me some feedback. Even more, because that shit is valuable. I am gonna go take a nap. Peace out.